Before we talk about why Red Hood has become one of DC's biggest examples of wasted potential, we first need to understand why fans cared about him in the first place. Because Red Hood wasn't supposed to be just another member of the Bat family. He wasn't supposed to be another Robin. He wasn't supposed to be another sidekick standing in Batman's shadow. Jason Todd was different, and ironically, that's exactly why people loved him. When most people think of Robin, they think of the cheerful, optimistic partner who helps Batman save the day. But Jason Todd never really fit that mold. Even before he became Red Hood, Jason had a reputation for being more aggressive, more emotional, and more reckless than the Robins who came before him and after him. Unlike Dick Grayson, who often brought light into Batman's dark world, Jason reflected the darkness that Gotham created. He was a troubled kid trying to survive in one of the most dangerous cities in comics. Different versions of his origin exist, but the most famous version tells us that Batman first encountered Jason while he was attempting to steal the tires off the Batmobile. Think about that for a second. Most heroes meet their future sidekicks through some noble or inspiring circumstance. Batman met Jason because the kid was literally stealing from him. That alone tells you everything you need to know about Jason Todd. He wasn't polished. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't naturally heroic. He was a survivor, a kid shaped by hardship, poverty, and the brutal reality of Gotham City. Batman saw something in him, not just potential, but a reflection of himself. Another lost child who needed guidance before the city consumed him. So he took him in. He trained him. He gave him a purpose. And eventually, Jason became the second Robin. But from the beginning, Jason struggled with anger. He wasn't the kind of person who could simply watch evil happen and patiently wait for justice to run its course. When criminals hurt innocent people, Jason wanted them punished. Not arrested, punished. And that tension became one of the most important parts of his character, because while Batman believed every criminal deserved due process, Jason often questioned whether some people deserved mercy at all. Those philosophical differences would eventually become the foundation of everything Red Hood would later represent. But before any of that could happen, tragedy struck, and not just comic book tragedy. We're talking about one of the most infamous moments in comic book history. In 1988, DC published A Death in the Family. What happened next would change Jason Todd forever. At the time, Jason wasn't particularly popular with readers. Many fans found him too angry, too impulsive, too difficult compared to Dick Grayson or Tim Drake. So DC did something almost unbelievable. They allowed fans to decide Jason's fate. Through a telephone voting system, readers were asked a simple question. Should Jason Todd live or die? And the fans chose death. Think about how insane that is. An entire comic book company handed the fate of a major character over to the audience, and the audience voted to kill him. The result was brutal. Jason was captured and beaten by the Joker, then left in a warehouse rigged to explode. Batman raced against time to save him, but he was too late. Jason Todd died. Today, comic book deaths don't always carry much weight. Characters die, then they come back, then they die again, then they come back again. But back then, things were different. Jason's death mattered. It haunted Batman, it haunted Gotham, and it haunted readers. For years, Jason Todd became the symbol of Batman's greatest failure. The Robin he couldn't save, the son he lost, the mistake he could never undo. And that's where most characters would have remained. A tragic memory, a cautionary tale. But Jason Todd's story wasn't over. Years later, DC brought him back from the dead. Now, comic book resurrections aren't exactly rare, but what made Jason special wasn't the resurrection itself, it was what came after. Because Jason didn't come back as Robin. He didn't come back looking for forgiveness, and he definitely didn't come back looking for another chance to be Batman's sidekick. He came back angry. He came back broken. And most importantly, he came back with questions Batman couldn't answer, questions fans themselves had been asking for years. Why is the Joker still alive? Why did Batman allow monsters to keep hurting people? How many innocent lives had been lost because villains kept escaping and returning? Jason wasn't interested in the traditional superhero answer, and that's what made him fascinating. Then came the story that would define him forever. Batman Under the Red Hood. To this day, many fans consider it the greatest Red Hood story ever told. Not because of the action, not because of the fights, but because of the emotion. At its core, Under the Red Hood wasn't a story about a vigilante with guns. It was a story about a son confronting his father, a story about betrayal, a story about grief, a story about two people who loved each other but could no longer understand each other. Jason didn't want Batman to kill every criminal. He wanted to know why Batman couldn't make one exception. The Joker murdered him, destroyed his life, tortured him, and yet Batman still refused to cross that line. That confrontation transformed Jason Todd from a forgotten Robin into one of the most compelling characters in DC Comics, because he wasn't simply fighting Batman, he was challenging Batman's entire philosophy. And that's why Red Hood became so popular. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a villain, he existed somewhere in the middle, a walking contradiction, a victim turned vigilante, a former sidekick turned rival, a son who felt abandoned, and a character whose pain felt real. That complexity is what made Red Hood special. Not the guns, not the helmet, not the costume. It was the fact that Jason Todd represented a question that DC had never fully answered. What happens when Batman fails to save one of his own? And for a brief moment, Red Hood looked like he was about to become one of the most important characters in all of DC Comics. Unfortunately, that's where the problems began. After Under the Red Hood, it felt like DC had struck gold. Not silver, not bronze, gold. Because for the first time in a long time, Batman had a character in his world who could challenge him on every level. Not physically, not intellectually, but philosophically. And that's what made Red Hood dangerous. Think about Batman's rogues gallery for a second. The Joker wants chaos. The Riddler wants attention. Two-Face is consumed by chance. Bane wants to prove his superiority. But Jason wasn't trying to break Batman. He was trying to prove Batman wrong. And those are two completely different things. That's what made Red Hood so compelling. He wasn't a villain, at least not in the traditional sense. Because when Jason looked at Gotham, he saw the same problem many readers saw. The system wasn't working. Criminals escaped. People died. The cycle repeated itself again and again and again. And Batman kept refusing to cross the line. Jason's answer was simple. If the system doesn't work, change the system. If criminals keep returning, make sure they can't. If fear controls Gotham, become something even criminals fear. And whether you agreed with him or not, you understood him. That's the key. You didn't have to agree with Red Hood. You just had to understand why he felt the way he did. In many ways, Jason represented the audience's frustration. The question comic fans have been asking for years. Why is the Joker still alive? How many innocent people have died because Batman refuses to kill him? Why do Gotham's villains always get another chance? Why does the cycle never end? Jason became the physical embodiment of those questions, and for the first time, Batman didn't have an easy answer. This is where Red Hood found his perfect role. Not as a villain, not as a hero, but as an anti-hero, a character who wanted justice but wasn't willing to follow the same rules. And comic readers love anti-heroes because anti-heroes create tension. They force difficult conversations. They challenge the moral certainty of traditional heroes. That's why characters like the Punisher, Wolverine, and Venom became so popular. They existed in the gray area, and Red Hood was DC's version of that concept. But Jason had something those characters didn't: a personal relationship with the hero he opposed. This wasn't Punisher arguing with Spider-Man. This wasn't Venom arguing with Captain America. This was Batman's son, or at least as close to a son as Bruce Wayne was ever willing to admit. Every disagreement felt personal. Every confrontation carried emotional weight. Every fight felt like a family argument that had spiraled completely out of control. And readers loved it. Imagine you're Batman. You can dismiss the Joker. You can dismiss Bane. You can dismiss almost any villain in Gotham. But how do you dismiss someone who knows you? Someone you've trained? Someone you've raised? Someone whose life was destroyed under your watch? You can't. And that's exactly why Jason mattered. For a brief moment, it looked like DC understood this. Red Hood wasn't just another Bat family member. He was his own force, his own ideology, his own corner of the DC universe. The possibilities were endless. DC could have made him the kingpin of Gotham's underworld. They could have turned him into a global anti-hero. They could have built an entire franchise around his struggle with Batman's ideals. They could have explored the psychological effects of resurrection. They could have explored his trauma, his anger, his guilt, his identity. There were stories everywhere. And honestly, there was a period where it looked like they were heading in that direction. Jason was becoming one of the most talked about characters in the Batman mythos. Fans were excited. Writers were interested. The character felt unpredictable. Anything could happen. And that's a great compliment you can give a fictional character. You genuinely don't know where their story is going next. But then, something started to change. Slowly at first. Almost so slowly that fans didn't notice it. The edge started disappearing. The danger started disappearing. The conflict started disappearing. And little by little, the character that once challenged Batman's entire worldview started becoming just another guy standing next to Batman in group shots. And that's where the real problem begins. Because Red Hood's downfall didn't happen overnight. There wasn't one bad comic, one bad writer, or one terrible decision. It happened through a series of choices that slowly stripped away the very things that made Jason Todd so special.
So, where did it all go wrong? Because the truth is, Red Hood didn't become a bad character. Jason Todd is still one of DC's most interesting characters. The problem is that DC never seemed to decide what they wanted him to be. After Under the Red Hood, Jason had a clear identity. He wasn't a hero and he wasn't a villain. He was an anti-hero, a character willing to cross lines that Batman never would. That was his role. That was what made him unique. But over the years, that identity became less and less clear. One comic would portray Jason as a ruthless vigilante. The next would have him working comfortably alongside Batman. Sometimes he was using guns, sometimes he wasn't, sometimes he was challenging Batman's philosophy. Other times, he felt like just another member of the Bat family. Instead of evolving, his character started changing depending on who was writing him. And that inconsistency made it difficult for fans to know who Red Hood really was. Even more disappointing was the loss of his biggest strength, his conflict with Batman. Jason wasn't interesting because he could fight Batman. He was interesting because he challenged Batman's beliefs. Every confrontation forced Bruce to defend his no-kill rule. Every argument raised questions fans had been asking for years. But as time went on, that tension slowly faded. Instead of standing apart from the Bat family, Jason started blending into it. And when you remove the conflict, You remove what made Red Hood special. Then came another problem. Jason never seemed allowed to grow. Every time he took a step forward, another story would pull him back. He'd learn, he'd change, then everything would reset. Meanwhile, characters like Nightwing, Harley Quinn, and Damian Wayne continued to evolve and carve out their own identities. Jason, on the other hand, often found himself repeating the same emotional journey. Still angry, still conflicted, still trying to prove the same point. And that's why so many fans now call him a potential man. Not because he lacks potential, but because his potential never seems to lead anywhere. He has one of the richest backstories in DC, one of the most compelling relationships with Batman, one of the most fascinating moral perspectives in comics. The ingredients for greatness have always been there, but the payoff never comes. And that's the real tragedy of Red Hood. It's not that DC created a bad character, it's that they created an incredible one, and never fully committed to what made him great. And that's exactly why Red Hood has become one of DC's biggest examples of wasted potential. I think the answer is yes. Not because Red Hood isn't popular, not because he doesn't have fans, and definitely not because he's a bad character. It's because, despite everything he has going for him, Jason Todd has never reached the level he should have. Think about it. This is a character with one of the greatest origin stories in comic books, a death that changed Batman forever, a resurrection that shocked readers, a philosophy that directly challenged the world's greatest detective, and one of the best animated films DC has ever made. By every measure, Red Hood should have become one of DC's flagship characters. Instead, he became a character that's always almost there, always one great story away from breaking through, always one creative direction away from becoming something bigger. That's why the phrase potential man fits him so well. Because every time Jason appears, fans don't talk about what he has accomplished. They talk about what he could accomplish, what he could become, what DC should do with him next. His potential has become more memorable than his actual journey, and that's a shame. Because Red Hood shouldn't live in Batman's shadow forever. He shouldn't exist just to argue with Bruce every few years before everything goes back to normal. He deserves stories that push him forward, stories that let him grow, stories that let him become more than just the Robin who came back. At the end of the day, I don't think fans are asking for Jason Todd to replace Batman. They're not asking him to become the next Nightwing. They're simply asking DC to commit to the character they already created. A character who challenged Batman's beliefs. A character who forced readers to ask uncomfortable questions. A character who proved that sometimes the most compelling heroes are the ones who don't have all the answers. Maybe one day DC will finally figure out what to do with Red Hood. And honestly, I hope they do. Because beneath all the inconsistent writing, the constant resets, and the missed opportunities, there's still an incredible character waiting to break free. And maybe that's the most frustrating part of all. We know he's capable of greatness. We've already seen it. We just haven't seen enough of it. If you enjoyed this video, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Red Hood has become DC's biggest wasted opportunity? Or do you think his best stories are still ahead of him? If you enjoyed this breakdown, consider subscribing because this is just the beginning. We'll be diving into more comic characters, stories, and the creative decisions that made or broke them. Until next time, I'll see you in the next one.